Welcome to America's Lost Empires. When we think of the New World, we picture a silent, pristine wilderness. An empty land, waiting for history to begin. But this is a myth. For thousands of years before any ship crossed the Atlantic, this continent was home to a world of lost civilizations. This is their story. It begins in a world of ice, with the first hunters who survived among giants. It is the story of the enigmatic Mound Builders who built sacred cathedrals of earth, aligned with the stars. It is the story of Cahokia, a forgotten metropolis larger than London in its day. It is the story of the masters of the desert, who carved entire cities into sheer cliff walls, and the canal builders who tamed the arid lands with 1,000 miles of waterways. This was not a wilderness. It was a continent of nations, of engineers, of astronomers, and of kings. Join us as we journey back and uncover the epic Pre-Columbian Chronicle. The first Americans journey into a new world. Imagine a world not of green and blue, but of white, brown, and a piercing, crystal-clear sky. A world locked in the grip of the last great ice age, a time we call the Pleistocene. The northern pole is capped by an incomprehensible sheet of ice miles thick, and its frozen fingers reach down to cover what is now Canada and the northern United States. The oceans have been leached of their water to feed these glaciers, and the sea level has fallen by over 400 feet. This is not a world that welcomes human life. It is a world that resists it. And yet humanity in its infancy is already pushing against every known boundary. Our story begins not on a bridge, but on a continent that no longer exists. We call it the Bering Land Bridge, but this name is deceptively simple. It implies a narrow strip of land, a temporary convenience. The reality was far grander. This was Beringia, a vast, lost subcontinent 1,000 miles wide from north to south. It connected what we now know as Siberia with Alaska. It was not a barren wasteland of ice. Because the air was so dry, heavy snow could not form here. Instead, Beringia was a windswept, treeless steppe tundra. It was a cold, hard land, yes, but it was also full of life. This was the mammoth steppe. Great herds of woolly mammoths, their fur thick and matted, roamed this landscape, their tusks like curved scythes against the pale sky. They were joined by herds of steppe bison, ancient horses, and caribou. And where these great grazers went, the great predators followed, cave lions, short-faced bears, and a small, tenacious hunter that had learned to thrive in the cold. Homo sapiens. For thousands of years, these first people lived in Beringia. This was not a quick crossing. It was a homeland. They were not migrating, so much as they were simply living, following the herds, raising their children, and telling their stories under the shimmering dance of the auroras. Genetic evidence tells us this was a Beringian standstill. For generations upon generations, they were isolated in this cold refuge, a population of hunters poised between two worlds. They were masters of this environment. From the scraps of willow and dwarf birch, they built fires. From the bones and ivory of the mammoth, they carved tools and delicate, sharp-eyed needles. With these needles and the sinew of caribou, they stitched tailored, fur-lined clothing, parkas, trousers, and boots, that allowed them to survive in temperatures that would kill a modern human in minutes. They were a people of profound patience and resilience. Then, around 16,000 to 17,000 years ago, the world began to change. The Great Thaw commenced. The planet was warming, and the glaciers, those towering walls of ice to the east, began to melt. This warming would, in time, drown their homeland of Beringia beneath the rising sea. But it also presented an opportunity. Two doors, long sealed, were beginning to crack open. The first door was terrifying. To the east of Beringia stood two massive adjacent ice sheets, the Laurentide, which covered eastern North America, and the Cordilleran, which sat upon the Rocky Mountains. As they melted, a path began to open between them, a narrow, desolate channel we call the ice-free corridor. But this was no welcoming path. It was a gauntlet. Imagine walking into a valley where the walls on either side are not rock but solid, shimmering ice a mile high. The wind howling down this corridor would have been relentless, a physical blow. The ground was not soil but gravel and barren glacial till. There was little food, little water that wasn't locked in ice, and almost no shelter. It was a sterile, alien landscape, and yet some people took this path. Hunters, driven by a need to see what lay beyond, or perhaps following the first pioneering herds of bison, ventured into this corridor. It would have been a journey of unimaginable hardship, a desperate gamble where every day was a fight against starvation and the crushing, oppressive cold. But there was another way. A second door. Many archaeologists now believe the first people to enter the Americas did not walk. They paddled. This is the coastal route hypothesis. While the inland was blocked by ice, the warming climate meant the Pacific coastline, while still rugged, was becoming viable. These people were not the mammoth hunters of the steppe, but a different people, or perhaps the same people with different skills. They were a maritime culture, in small boats made of animal skin stretched over driftwood or bone frames. They skirted the edge of the ice. Their world was a vertical one, a narrow strip of land between the glacier and the sea. They did not hunt mammoths. They hunted seals and sea lions. They fished for salmon and cod. They harvested the rich kelp highway, forests of seaweed that provided a bounty of shellfish, sea urchins, and seabirds. This was also a perilous journey, facing storms and treacherous icy waters, but it was one with a constant, reliable source of food. This theory explains one of the greatest mysteries of American archaeology. Sites like Monte Verde in southern Chile, which date to over 14,500 years ago. These people were at the very bottom of the continent, thousands of miles south before the inland ice-free corridor was even fully open or habitable. The only way they could have gotten there so fast was by boat, following the coast, leapfrogging from one habitable inlet to the next. These two groups, the walkers of the corridor and the paddlers of the coast, were the true first Americans. And the continent they entered was a world that no human had ever seen. It was a land of giants. This was not the empty, familiar wilderness of later centuries. This was a land ruled by megafauna. Herds of 14-foot-tall mammoths and mastodons navigated the forests. Giant ground sloths, taller than a giraffe when they reared up, lazily pulled down branches. Herds of native horses and camels roamed plains that would one day be Ohio and Nevada. And the predators were even more fearsome. Saber-toothed cats with 8-inch canines, massive short-faced bears that could look a man in the eye, and dire wolves stalked the new arrivals. For these first human bands, the challenge was absolute. Every plant was new. Every animal was unknown. The rules of survival had to be rewritten from scratch. They were a handful of people in a vast, wild, and dangerous paradise. And then something extraordinary happened. A culture was born. The first truly widespread, identifiable culture of the Americas. We call them the Clovis people. Around 13,000 years ago, a new technology appears in the archaeological record, almost simultaneously, all across the continent. It is a stone tool, but it is more than a tool. It is a masterpiece. We call it the Clovis point. It is a large, beautifully crafted spearhead, made from high-quality stone like chert or obsidian. But its defining feature is the flute, a long, shallow channel chipped away from the base. This flute allowed the point to be securely hafted onto a wooden spear shaft, creating a devastatingly effective weapon. The Clovis people were, above all, mammoth hunters. We find their points mingled with the bones of these great beasts. A Clovis hunt would have been a high-stakes, terrifying endeavor. It was not one man with a spear. It was a coordinated attack by a group of hunters, using their knowledge of the animal, the landscape, and their superior technology to isolate and kill a 10-ton animal. Their success was explosive. In just a few hundred years, a blink of an eye in geological time, the Clovis culture spread from Nova Scotia to the American Southwest, from Washington State to Florida. They were the apex predators of this new world. They moved fast, lived in small mobile groups, and thrived on the abundance of the Ice Age. But their world was already ending. The climate continued to warm. The ice sheets retreated, the forests changed, and the great megafauna, the mammoths, the mastodons, the ground sloths, began to disappear. Whether they were hunted to extinction by the efficient Clovis people, or whether they were victims of the rapid climate change, or both, is a debate that rages to this day. By 11,000 years ago, the Clovis culture vanishes from the record. As abruptly as it appeared, the giants they hunted were gone, and the first Americans had to adapt once more, breaking into the hundreds of new, diverse cultures that would come to define the pre-Columbian world. The journey of these first people is the deep, foundational story of America. It is an odyssey of endurance against a landscape of ice and wind. It is a story of courage, of small bands of people paddling into an unknown sea or walking into a frozen corridor, with no map and no knowledge of what lay ahead. They were not just survivors. They were the pioneers of a continent, and their footsteps, though 15,000 IA, note 15,000 years old, are the first to be laid upon the land. An echo that sleeps beneath every city and every field of the world they were the first to call home. Hunters of the Ice Age. Surviving among giants, the world the first Americans inherited was not the one we know. The ice that had once capped the continent was in a slow, steady retreat, but its presence was still felt in the air, in the meltwater, rivers that carved new valleys, and in the very shape of the land. This was the late Pleistocene, a world caught in the long, slow exhale of the last great ice age. The landscape was a shifting mosaic. South of the vanishing ice, vast parklands of spruce and pine gave way to sprawling grasslands, landscapes more open than our own, capable of supporting life on a scale we can no longer comprehend. This was a world of giants. To be a human here, one of the Paleo-Indians, was to be a small, fragile creature in a land ruled by titans. Survival was not a given. It was an art, a science, and a daily act of courage. This was not a world you conquered. It was a world you learned to navigate. A world where you survived by your wits, your tools, and your profound understanding of the giants who walked beside you. These giants were the megafauna. The name feels almost too small for the reality. Imagine the sound of a forest being broken, not a twig snapping, but the sound of whole trees being pushed aside like reeds. This was the sound of the mastodon, a creature of the forest and wetlands, smaller than its famous cousin but more robust. It was a browsing animal, its large cone-shaped tusks perfectly evolved for stripping bark and branches. Then, on the open plains, there was the Columbian mammoth, a walking mountain of fur and muscle, standing 14 feet at the shoulder, its tusks spiraling out in magnificent, deadly curves. A single mammoth was a source of life, meat, hide, and bone, for an entire band of hunters. It was also a fortress of muscle, capable of crushing any predator that dared to approach. They were not alone. Giant ground sloths, some as large as a modern elephant, moved with a slow, deliberate power, rearing up on their hind legs to pull down entire trees. Herds of ancient horses, camels, and massive straight-horned bison. Bison, antiquous, flowed across the plains in dark, thundering rivers of meat. And where there is prey, there are predators. The humans were not the only hunters. They were the new competition. The most famous was Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat. It was not a fast runner, but an ambush predator of immense power. Its 8-inch canines designed not for biting, but for a deep, precise stabbing puncture at the throat of a trapped animal. Joining it in the shadows was the dire wolf, larger and heavier than any wolf today, a creature built for cracking bone. But the true king of this savage world, the creature that must have haunted the first people's nightmares, was the giant, short-faced bear, Arctodus simus, standing over 12 feet tall on its hind legs. It was a long-limbed terror built for speed. It was a kleptoparasite, a professional thief, evolved to smell a kill from miles away, run down the predators who made it, and claim the carcass for itself. This was the world the Clovis people stepped into, and they did not just survive, they thrived. They did this because they brought with them a revolutionary toolkit, a mind that could think in generations, and a weapon that changed the balance of power forever. The heart of their toolkit was the Clovis point, which we met in our last chapter. But this point was not a mere spear tip. It was the business end of a sophisticated weapon system. A human, no matter how strong, cannot throw a simple spear with enough force to penetrate the hide of a mammoth. It is a fatal miscalculation. The Clovis people used the atlatl, or spear thrower. This simple-looking stick, often carved from wood or bone, was a lever. It was an extension of the human arm. By fitting the end of their spear, a long, flexible dart, into a hook on the atlatl, a hunter could multiply their throwing power by a factor of 3. The dart didn't just fly. It flexed and snapped with incredible velocity, launching with a speed of over 90 miles per hour. This was the great equalizer. The atlatl gave a small, soft human the penetrating power to rival the bite of a Smilodon. It allowed them to hunt at a distance, to strike with lethal force from outside the immediate crushing range of their prey. A Clovis hunt was not an act of impulse. It was a planned, almost ritualistic event. Let us imagine a small band, perhaps 15 people in total, brothers, sisters, cousins, children. They have been tracking a small group of mammoths for days, watching, learning. They are not looking for the massive, powerful matriarch or the bulls in their prime. They are looking for an opening, a young adult separated from the herd, or an old individual lagging behind. They find one, a lone bull grazing near a riverbank. The air is cold, the wind in their favor. The hunters are ghosts, moving with a patience born of absolute necessity. They carry their atlatls, darts tipped with freshly napped points of razor-sharp chert. The attack is a moment of sudden coordinated violence. It is not a charge. It is a volley. From the cover of rocks or low scrub, the hunters rise as one. The zip and whisper of the atlatls is the only sound. The darts fly, arcing across the cold air. They are not aiming for the head or the thick armored back. They are aiming for the vital organs deep inside the rib cage, or for the belly. 1, then 2, then 3 points find their mark. The great beast bellows, a sound of rage and confusion, and wheels around to charge. But the hunters are already gone. They have vanished back into the landscape. Now the second hunt begins, the hunt of patience. They do not follow closely. They follow at a distance. The wounds are not instantly fatal, but they are mortal. They have punctured a lung, or the stomach. The hunters wait. They track the animal for hours, perhaps even a day, waiting for blood loss and exhaustion to do their work. They are specialists in a war of attrition. Finally, the giant stumbles, sinks to its knees, and is still. Even now, the danger is not over. The scent of blood travels far on the Ice Age wind. The hunters must work quickly, their stoneflake knives moving with practiced skill. They are surrounded by competitors. A kill site was a beacon, attracting every predator for miles. The short-faced bear and the dire wolves would be coming. This is the bounty. A single mammoth provides thousands of pounds of meat which must be cut into strips and smoked over a quick fire, or frozen in the cold air. The hide, thick and insulating, is peeled back to be used for shelter or clothing. The leg bones are cracked for their rich, high-energy marrow. The tendons and sinew are saved for thread and for lashing tool to handle. Even the tusks are used, carved into tools, needles, or perhaps small sacred objects. Nothing is wasted. This was the Clovis way of life. It was a life of high risk and high reward, a culture built on the pursuit of giants. But this very specific, hyper-specialized world was coming to an end. Around 11,000 years ago, the climate warmed again, decisively. The spruce parklands vanished, replaced by the great prairies. The giants, already struggling with a changing food source and perhaps pressured by this new, hyper-efficient human predator, began to vanish. The mammoths, the mastodons, the sloths, the saber-toothed cats, one by one, they faded into extinction. The Paleo-Indian hunters faced a choice: adapt or die with the giants. They adapted. And the proof of this adaptation is found in another, even more beautiful piece of stone technology: the Folsom Point. As the mammoths disappeared, the hunters of the Great Plains turned their full attention to the remaining giant, Bison antiquus. These ancient bison were larger than modern buffalo, with massive horns, and they moved in herds that dwarfed anything we know today. The Folsom hunters, the descendants of the Clovis, created a new tool for this new target. The Folsom Point was smaller, thinner, and a masterpiece of stoneworking. It had a characteristic flute, a channel running almost the entire length of the point. This made it incredibly thin and light, but also brutally effective against the bison. But the hunt changed. A single hunter could not easily take down a bison in a herd of thousands. The Folsom people perfected the communal hunt. This was a massive, coordinated effort involving the entire band. They would use the landscape itself as a weapon. They would find a dead-end canyon, an arroyo, or a steep cliff. Then, with shouts, with waving hides, perhaps with fire, they would create a panic, a stampede. They would funnel the terrified herd, a thundering wave of hooves and horns, toward the trap. The lead animals would see the cliff too late, and the pressure of the herd behind them would force them over. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of bison would fall to their deaths, a river of meat at the bottom of the ravines. This was a different kind of survival, less about the individual prowess of the mammoth hunt, and more about the collective, strategic power of the community. For 2,000 years, these Paleo-Indian cultures, the hunters of the mammoth and the bison, reigned supreme. They were a people of ice and grassland, of stone and sinew. They lived and died by the giants, their lives interwoven with the last great pulse of the Pleistocene. When we look at their tools today, preserved under glass in our museums, we are not just looking at spearheads. We are looking at the relics of a lost world. We are holding the key to a time when humanity was new to this continent, a time when our ancestors looked out upon a wilderness of impossible beasts, and did not shrink from it. They hunted. They survived. And they laid the deep enduring foundations for all the human history that was to come. The Great Thaw, a continent transformed, the world of the fulsome hunters, the world of the great bison kills and the endless cold plains, was itself living on borrowed time. The planet was breathing, and with each breath the great cold was lifting. The change had been coming for millennia, a slow, almost imperceptible shift in the Earth's tilt in orbit. But now it was accelerating. The final days of the Pleistocene were at hand. We call it the Great Thaw. But this gentle name betrays the sheer violence of the event. This was not a soft spring melt. It was a global cataclysm, a profound and absolute transformation of the world's climate. The Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, those colossal mountains of ice that had held a continent hostage for 100,000 years, were not just melting, they were collapsing. Imagine the sound. A sound not heard since the world began. The groaning and cracking of ice walls a mile high. The thunder of icebergs the size of mountains calving into newly formed lakes. And above all, the sound of water. Water was everywhere. Rivers born from the dying glaciers raged across the land, carving canyons and valleys in a matter of centuries. These were not the rivers we know today. They were torrents choked with gravel and silt. Billions of tons of meltwater surging toward the sea. The greatest of these, the glacial River Warren, carved the valley that now holds the gentle Minnesota River, a tiny echo of the monster that bore it. The land itself, released from the crushing weight of the ice, began to rebound, rising slowly, a process that continues even today. And the oceans, fed by this global deluge, rose by hundreds of feet, swallowing coastlines, drowning the kelp highways, and turning coastal plains into shallow continental shelves. The very map of the world was being redrawn. This new, warmer, wetter world was a disaster for the giants. The mammoth steppe, that vast, cold, dry grassland that had stretched from Beringia to the Atlantic, could not survive. It was replaced. In the east, a new kind of forest rose up, a dense, dark forest of spruce and fir, which then gave way to the great deciduous forests of oak, hickory, chestnut, and maple. In the west, the open parklands dried, becoming the vast arid sagebrush deserts and the short grass prairies we know today. The giants were trapped. Their world, their food source, was vanishing. The mastodons, browsers of the spruce forest, found their forest changing. The mammoths, grazers of the endless grass, found their plains shrinking, fragmented by dense, impassable woods. And then there was the hunter. For decades, we have debated the cause of the quaternary extinction. Was it this catastrophic climate change? Or was it the arrival of the Paleo-Indians with their deadly atlatls and their relentless efficiency? The first theory is one of climate. The animals were specialists. They were perfectly adapted to a cold, stable world. When that world warmed and warmed fast, they simply could not evolve. Their breeding cycles were too slow. Their food sources disappeared. They were stressed, their populations fragmented, and they faded away. The second theory is one of force. It is the overkill or blitzkrieg hypothesis. It argues that Homo sapiens, the new invasive predator, was the sole cause, arriving in a continent of naive animals that had never known a predator that could kill at a distance. The Clovis and Folsom hunters were an unstoppable force. They were, this theory states, the first great ecological disaster caused by humankind, sweeping down the continent and leaving a trail of bones. But the truth, as it so often is likely a combination of both. It was a devastating 1-2 punch. Imagine the last herds of Columbian mammoths. Their world is already shrinking. The grasslands are becoming forests. Their populations are smaller, isolated in pockets of favorable habitat. They're stressed and their numbers are dwindling. Into this fragile world steps the human hunter, the most adaptable predator the planet has ever produced. The hunters did not need to kill every last one. They only needed to tip the balance. By preying on the young or by taking down breeding females, they applied a pressure that the already stressed species simply could not withstand. One by one they vanished. The giants that had defined an entire epoch were gone. The trumpeting of the mammoth, the ground-shaking tread of the giant sloth, the roar of the short-faced bear, all fell silent. By 10,000 years ago, the great Pleistocene megafauna were ghosts. Their disappearance left a profound void, and it presented the first Americans with their greatest crisis. The entire foundation of their culture, a life built on the pursuit of giants, was now gone. The fulsome hunters, the masters of the bison hunt, found their great horned bison vanishing, replaced by a smaller, faster, more modern species. The choice was the same as it had been on the ice: adapt or perish, and so began a new chapter in the human story of the Americas. We call this the Archaic period. The name is misleading. It implies something static, something primitive and unchanged. The reality is that this was perhaps the most dynamic and creative period in American prehistory. It was the age of the great adaptation. With the giants gone, the people turned to the small. They became, for the first time, intimate with their local landscapes. They could no longer follow massive herds across the continent. They had to stay put and learn to live with what was there. The age of the specialist was over. The age of the generalist had begun. This new life was defined by the region. In the new eastern forest, they became forest archaic people. They learned to hunt the elusive white-tailed deer, the black bear, and the turkey. They learned the seasonal rhythms of the woods. They learned that the true bounty was not just in the meat, but in the trees themselves. The autumns were a time of harvest. They gathered hickory nuts, acorns, and walnuts by the bushel. But these nuts were not easily edible. Acorns, in particular, are filled with bitter, indigestible tannin. So the archaic people invented new technologies. They developed nutting stones to crack the hulls, and then learned to boil the nut meat in water, leaching away the bitterness, creating a rich, calorie-dense paste. To do this, they used hot rock boiling. They would dig a pit, line it with a watertight hide, and fill it with water. Then in a fire nearby, they would heat stones until they were glowing, and drop them one by one into the water-filled pit, bringing it to a boil to cook their food. In the river valleys, they became masters of the water. They invented fish hooks carved from bone, and nets woven from plant fibers. They built massive, complex fish weirs, V-shaped walls of stone in the rivers, to channel fish into traps. And for the first time, a new tool appears, a tool that signals a new relationship with the world. Not a flaked, sharp tool for killing, but a heavy groundstone tool for changing the landscape itself. The axe. With the groundstone axe, they could now fell trees, clearing small areas for camps and crucially carving great dugout canoes from single logs. The canoe opened the rivers as highways connecting communities, and allowing for trade and travel in a way the foot hunters of the Ice Age could never have imagined. Out west, in the drying Great Basin, the archaic life was different again. It was a life of seasonal rounds. People would move from the lowlands in the spring to gather seeds and plants, to the mountains in the summer to hunt bighorn sheep, to the marshes in the fall to harvest ducks and cattail roots. They left behind a new toolkit, the grinding stone. The mano and metate, a simple handstone and a flat slab, became the central tools of life used for grinding the tiny, tough seeds of the desert into life-sustaining flour. The world of the Paleo-Indian was a world of men, focused on the great hunt. The world of the archaic was, in many ways, a world of women, focused on the patient, stable, and reliable harvest of plants, roots, and nuts. This foraging revolution provided a more stable food base, and for the first time, populations began to grow. This was the great lesson of the Archaic period. The Great Thaw had shattered the continent into 1,000 different new worlds: forests, deserts, coasts, mountains. And in response, humanity shattered into 1,000 different cultures, each one a unique, specialized, and brilliant solution to the challenge of living in one of New America's many new rooms. This period would last for over 7,000 years, far longer than all of recorded history. It was the long, slow, foundational period where the deep roots of future civilizations would be set. It was not an age of kings or empires. It was an age of resilience, of deep knowledge, and of finding a new, more balanced place in a world that, having lost its giants, had finally, truly, become the world of human beings. Seeds of civilization, the dawn of agriculture. For 7,000 years, the archaic peoples had lived in a perfect, delicate balance with the New World. They were the great generalists, the masters of resilience. They had learned the rhythm of every river, the secret of every forest, and the timing of every season. Theirs was a life of movement, a seasonal round following the deer, the ripening nuts, and the spawning fish. It was a successful and enduring way of life, but a revolution was coming. It would not arrive with the thunder of a collapsing glacier or the roar of a saber-toothed cat. It would arrive in the form of a tiny, unassuming seed. This revolution did not begin with a brilliant invention, a single moment where a person discovered farming. It was not a conscious choice, but a slow, almost accidental entanglement, a dance between people and plants that would, over thousands of years, fundamentally change what it meant to be human. This was the dawn of agriculture, and it happened twice, in two very different ways, in two very different Americas. Our first story begins in the East, in the lush green and watery world of the eastern woodlands. Here, in the fertile floodplains of rivers like the Ohio, the Mississippi, and the Tennessee, archaic hunter-gatherers had created a kind of paradise. They lived in the same river valleys for generations, harvesting the rich bounty of the forest, deer, turkey, nuts, and the incredible abundance of the rivers, freshwater mussels, catfish, drum. They became, in a sense, sedentary long before they were farmers. They lived in small, permanent base camps and made seasonal trips, but they always returned to their home on the river. And around these camps there were trash heaps, or middens. These were places where they discarded mussel shells, animal bones, scraps of food, and the seeds of wild plants they had gathered. And here, in these disturbed, nutrient-rich soils, something remarkable happened. The plants that they had been gathering, weedy, opportunistic plants, began to thrive. The people noticed. They saw that the weeds they valued, like goosefoot, which we call chenopodium, and sumpweed or marsh elder, grew larger and more reliably in these gardens by accident. They saw that the sunflowers produced bigger seeds, and that the bottle gourds and squashes they used for containers and net floats were growing right where they were needed. So they began to help them along. This was not yet farming, it was gardening. Imagine a woman in the late Archaic period. She is not a farmer. She is a forager. But as she clears a patch of ground for her fire, she scatters a handful of goosefoot seeds. When she returns from a fishing trip, she pulls the competing weeds from around a promising-looking squash vine. She is not trying to change the world. She is simply trying to make her foraging a little easier, a little more predictable. Over hundreds, then thousands of note of years, this gentle encouragement became a true partnership. The plants themselves began to change. The seeds of the goosefoot became larger, its seed coat thinner, making it easier to digest. The sunflower heads grew heavier, packed with rich, oily seeds, and the squash became fleshier, more of a food and less of a container. This was the Eastern Agricultural Complex. It was a uniquely American revolution, born not from a single staple crop but from a basket of cultivated local plants. These first gardens were not fields. They were small, supplementary patches of food that existed alongside the traditional staples of hunting and gathering. They were a buffer against a bad nut harvest or a poor hunting season. This quiet local revolution slowly tethered people to the land in a new way. It gave them a reason to stay in one place for longer, to tend their patches, to guard their harvest. It gave them a small storable surplus, and that surplus, however small, was the first crack in the hunter-gatherer world, the first hint of the great civilizations to come. Now, let us turn our gaze 1,000 miles to the west, to a land of stunning, stark beauty and profound challenge, the American Southwest. Here, in the arid highlands of Arizona and New Mexico, there were no lush river valleys, no vast deciduous forests. This was a land of sun, stone, and scarcity. The archaic people here were masters of survival. Nomadic foragers who knew the location of every hidden spring and the season of every edible cactus. Into this harsh world, around 4,000 years ago, a traveler arrived. It was not a person, but a seed, carried north, hand to hand, on a journey that had begun thousands of miles south in Mesoamerica. We call it teosinte in its wild form. We know it as maize or corn. This was not the corn we know today. It was not a large sweet cob. It was a small, tough tropical plant, a stalk with a few tiny kernels, each locked in a hard case. It was frankly unimpressive. It was a curiosity, a minor snack food. For 1,000 years, the archaic peoples of the Southwest treated it as just that. They continued their nomadic lives, planting a few stalks of this strange grass in the damp earth near a seasonal stream, and then moving on, hoping to find a small harvest when they returned months later. But in this long period, this 1,000-year-long experiment, another partnership was being forged. The people were not just planting corn. They were creating it. Every year they saved seeds. They saved them from the plants that had survived the drought. They saved them from the stalks that produced slightly larger kernels. They saved them from the plants that matured just a little bit faster in the short, high-elevation growing season. They were, in effect, teaching this tropical plant how to live in the desert. And the plant, in turn, was teaching them how to be farmers. After 1,000 years of patient selection, a new kind of maize was born, one adapted to the arid north. And with this new, more reliable, more productive corn, the entire world of the Southwest had to change. Because corn is a demanding partner. You cannot walk away from a cornfield. It must be tended. It must be weeded. It must be protected from birds and rodents. And in the desert, it must be watered. Most importantly, it must be harvested, and crucially, it must be stored. This single plant triggered a cascade of innovations, a chain reaction that built a new civilization. First, people needed to stay put. This was the end of the archaic rounds. They began to build permanent homes. They dug into the earth itself for insulation against the desert heat and cold, building pit houses, sturdy semi-subterranean dwellings of timber and mud. For the first time, true villages were born. Second, they needed a way to store the grain. A woven basket cannot keep out the mice and the insects. And so a new technology arose, pottery. People learned to shape the clay of the desert and fire it into hard, durable vessels. Pots were the granaries of the new world, protecting the precious harvest that would keep the village alive through the winter. And third, they needed a way to eat the corn. Dried maize is hard, almost indigestible. The solution, discovered in Mesoamerica and brought north, was nixtamalization, soaking the corn in an alkaline solution of ash or lime. This process unlocks its niacin, making it profoundly nutritious. And the only way to do this To boil the corn into a soft, life-sustaining mash was in a fireproof ceramic pot. Pottery, pit houses, and permanent villages, all of these were the consequence of that one small, demanding seed. In the East, the revolution had been a gentle addition. In the Southwest, it was an absolute transformation. Eventually, this Mesoamerican revolution would travel east. Around 2,000 years ago, this new, highly productive corn finally found its way to the eastern woodlands. It did not replace the local garden plants. It supercharged them. Now the people of the river valleys had their ancient eastern agricultural complex, and they had the massive surplus of corn, soon to be joined by beans, which replenished the soil that corn depleted. This combination was explosive. For the first time in human history on this continent, there was a true, large-scale, and reliable food surplus. This surplus was the seed of everything we call civilization. It meant that populations could grow. It meant that villages could swell into towns. And for the very first time, it meant that some people did not have to farm. This surplus could feed specialists. It could feed priests who charted the stars, artists who carved stone and shell, and chiefs who organized labor. It was the fuel that would soon build great mounds of earth, complex trade networks, and in the Mississippi Valley, a city as large as any in Europe. The archaic hunter, free and nomadic, had become the farmer, bound to the soil. It was an unspoken contract. The people would care for the plants, and the plants would feed the people. This bargain was perhaps the most profound and far-reaching decision ever made by the first Americans. And it was a decision that, once made, could never be undone. The enigmatic Mound Builders, Ohio's Valley of Kings. If you travel today through the green, rolling river valleys of southern Ohio, you might notice something strange about the landscape. The land is gentle, carved by ancient rivers, but here and there, hills rise from the flat valley floor with an unnatural, perfect precision. Some are great conical peaks, sharp against the sky. Others are long linear embankments or perfect circles and squares, so vast they are only recognizable from the air. For centuries, settlers in this new land, the Ohio Valley, looked upon these works with awe and confusion. They were clearly not natural, but who could have built them? They imagined a lost race of giants or wandering Vikings or the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They could not believe that the native peoples they knew, the Shawnee or the Delaware, could be responsible for such monumental geometry. They were wrong. These earthworks were not the product of a foreign lost race. They were the legacy of the first Americans themselves. They were the cathedrals and pyramids of a new world, built not of stone but of earth, basket by basket, by two of the most fascinating and enigmatic cultures in North American prehistory. This is the story of the Adena and the Hopewell. And this, the valley of the Scioto River, was their sacred center. This was, in every sense, America's Valley of the Kings. Our story begins around 800 BCE, as the Archaic period, the long age of the generalist, was giving way to something new. The seeds of civilization, which we explored in our last chapter, were taking root. In the fertile floodplains of the Ohio Valley, people were no longer just passing through. They were settling down, tending their gardens of squash, sunflower, and goosefoot. This new stability, this tethering to the land, gave them something their ancestors never had: time and a storable surplus. And with this surplus, they began to invest their energy in a new, profound, and collective project, honoring the dead. The first of these cultures, we call the Adena, their lives were still rooted in the ancient ways. They hunted the white-tailed deer, fished the rich rivers, and gathered the nuts of the forest. But they were also part of this new agricultural experiment. And this new, more sedentary life allowed for a more complex social and ritual world. When an important person in their community died, they did not just bury them. They began a monument. Imagine a funeral 3,000 years ago. An elder, a shaman, or a great hunter has passed. The body is prepared with reverence. It is painted with bright red ochre, a symbolic color of blood and life. It is laid to rest not in a simple pit, but in a small tomb built of logs, set upon the river terrace. With the body are placed the things that mark their life. A beautifully polished stone pendant, called a gorget or a cloud blower pipe, a long stone tube, suggesting that smoking tobacco was a way to send prayers to the spirit world. Then, the work begins. The community gathers. With woven baskets, they dig earth from nearby pits, the borrow pit, and one basketful at a time they cover the log tomb. A small earthen mound is raised. It is a new permanent feature on the landscape, a marker, a sacred spot, but it does not end there. Perhaps years later, another important person dies. They are laid to rest next to or on top of the first burial. And the community gathers again, adding a new layer of earth. The mound grows. Generation after generation, this ritual is repeated. The mound becomes a central ancestral point for the people of the valley. It grows larger, steeper, more imposing. This is how the great conical mounds of the Adena, like the Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia, were born. They are not single monuments, but the collective work of centuries. 1,000 small burials, 1,000,000 baskets of earth, all culminating in a single massive declaration of lineage and reverence. The Adena people were the pioneers of this new world. They were the first to take the surplus of the land and turn it into monumental architecture. They were the first to create a landscape defined by ritual, but they were only the beginning. Around 100 BC, a new, even more dazzling culture arose in these same valleys, perhaps evolving directly from the Adena. The world they created was so rich, so sophisticated, and so widespread that archaeologists had to give it a different name. We call them the Hopewell. If the Adena were the pioneers, the Hopewell were the masters of a golden age. They took the Adena's ritual of mound building and expanded it into an art form, a science, and something approaching a continental religion. The Hopewell did not just build mounds. They built cathedrals of earth. In the Scioto River Valley, they built enormous ceremonial centers. These were not cities in the way we think of them. They were not places where thousands of people lived. They were sacred necropolises built for the dead and built for the gods. They were pilgrimage sites where scattered clans would gather at specific times of the year to conduct their most important ceremonies. And their designs were breathtaking. They built massive geometric earthworks, a perfect circle 1,000 feet across attached to a perfect square, a great octagon, its walls aligned with the precision of an astronomer. At the site we now call the Newark Earthworks, the Hopewell built a sprawling complex of circles, squares and avenues that covered over 4 square miles. Its great octagon aligns perfectly with the northernmost rising of the moon, an event that happens only once every 18.6 years. This is not the work of simple gardeners. This is the work of priests, of architects, and of astronomers who had studied the sky for generations, who understood the complex cycles of the sun and moon, and who encoded that cosmic knowledge into the land itself. They were shaping the earth to mirror the sky, but the true mystery, the thing that defines the Hopewell, is not just the scale of their earthworks, but the contents of their tombs. When archaeologists in the 19th century began to excavate these mounds, they found burials of almost unimaginable wealth. Inside the log tombs, they found skeletons laid out on platforms, surrounded by artifacts of breathtaking beauty, made from materials that came from every corner of the continent. This was the Hopewell interaction sphere. It was not an empire, held together by armies and kings. It was a vast, sprawling network of trade and belief, a shared idea that connected hundreds of different cultures across thousands of miles. From the shores of Lake Superior, 600 miles to the north, they acquired massive quantities of copper. They did not smelt it. They hammered it cold, into exquisite shapes. Breastplates embossed with sacred designs, heavy ear spools, and ceremonial axes. From the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, they acquired mica. This translucent silvery mineral was cut into paper thin. Intricate silhouettes the shape of a bird's talon, a serpent, or a human hand, perhaps to be sewn onto ceremonial robes. From the Gulf of Mexico, 800 miles to the south, they brought huge conch shells, which they carved and used as sacred drinking vessels. And most astonishingly, from Obsidian Cliff, in what is now Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming, they acquired obsidian. This black volcanic glass, 500 miles away, was carried hand to hand across mountains and prairies to be flaked by master artisans in Ohio into massive, razor-sharp blades, objects not of war but of pure, ritual power. This was not commerce. This was pilgrimage. This was a religious economy. People were not trading for wealth. They were trading for sacredness. The Hopewell Centers in Ohio were the spiritual heart of this network, a place where these exotic, powerful materials were brought, crafted into objects of power, and finally, taken out of the world of the living and deposited into the world of the dead. And the art itself tells us of their beliefs. Their most famous creations are the platform pipes. Unlike the simple tubes of the Adena, these pipes were carved from soft, beautiful pipestone into perfect, living effigies of the animals that surrounded them. A beaver, his tail cross-hatched, crouches on the platform. A hawk, its eyes alert, stares back at the smoker. A raven, a toad, a bear, a fish. These were not just decorations. They were almost certainly the tools of shamans. They were conduits, a way of connecting with the spirit world, of drawing the power of these animal guides into the self, and exhaling it as sacred smoke. For 500 years, this was the world, a continent bound by rivers, canoes, and a shared complex faith. And then, around 500 CE, it simply stopped. This is the final and greatest enigma of the Hopewell. It was not a violent collapse. We find no great fortress walls, no evidence of a widespread war. It was not a sudden disappearance, it was a fading. The trade routes that had carried obsidian and copper and shells simply dried up. The great ceremonial centers, the massive earthwork cathedrals, fell silent. They were not destroyed. They were just abandoned. The work of building, the ritual of 1,000,000 baskets of earth, ceased. Why? We may never know for certain. Perhaps the belief system itself, the religion that had held this vast network together, simply lost its meaning. Perhaps new technologies, like the arrival of the bow and arrow, decentralized power and made the old rituals obsolete. Perhaps the full-time intensive agriculture of maize, which was just arriving, created a new kind of society, one more focused on the village and the harvest than on the grand, continental pilgrimage. The people did not vanish. They simply turned their energy elsewhere. They broke apart from this grand, unified idea and became once again local cultures, the ancestors of the tribes who would, centuries later, build a new, even greater civilization at Cahokia. But they left behind their monuments, silent, grass-covered, and enigmatic. They are a testament to a time when the Ohio Valley was the spiritual center of a continent, a time when people could see the geometry of the cosmos and write it on the face of the earth. They are the sleeping earthen kings of a forgotten age. Cahokia, the rise and fall of America's first metropolis. For 500 years, the great Hopewell interaction sphere had been a memory. The Ohio Valley, once the sacred heart of a continent, had fallen silent, The world had once again become local. The people of the river valleys returned to their villages, their gardens, and the quiet rhythms of the forest. But the seeds of civilization once planted do not die. They simply wait. West of Ohio, in a land of even greater rivers, a new world was being born. This was a wide, flat, and impossibly fertile floodplain, a place where the mighty Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Illinois rivers all converge. We call it the American Bottom. Around 900 CE, this floodplain was a patchwork of small, quiet villages. The people here were farmers living in small settlements, tending their gardens of local plants and hunting the rich wildlife of the river bottom. And then, something happened. Around the year 1050 CE, a date as significant in American history as 1066 is in English history, a new idea ignited this floodplain. It was an explosion, a big bang of culture, population, and belief. From all directions, people began to stream into the American Bottom. They abandoned their small, scattered villages and came together to build something that had never been seen before on this continent. They came to build a city. We call it Cahokia. This was not a slow, organic growth. It was a sudden, planned, and monumental construction. It was, in every sense, America's first metropolis. At its peak in the year 1100, Cahokia was larger than London was at the same time. It covered 6 square miles and was home to an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 people, with thousands more living in satellite towns and farming villages that fed the urban center. It was the largest and most complex human settlement north of Mexico, and it was built not of stone, but of earth and wood, and fueled by a new, revolutionary power source, the Three Sisters. The trinity of corn, beans, and squash had finally arrived here in full force. Corn provided the calories, the great surplus of carbohydrates, but corn alone leaches the soil of nitrogen and, when eaten as a sole staple, can lead to malnutrition. The beans, however, fixed nitrogen back into the soil, and when eaten with corn provided a complete protein. The squash, growing low to the ground, provided vitamins, and its broad leaves shaded the soil, keeping it moist and free of weeds. This perfect agricultural system created a food surplus on a scale the Hopewell could only have dreamed of. And this surplus was the engine of Cahokia. It was the fuel that fed the builders, the priests, the artisans, and the new powerful class of rulers. Cahokia was a planned city. Its builders first leveled a vast 50-acre central plaza, a public space larger than 30 football fields, scraping the earth flat with a precision that is staggering to contemplate. This plaza was the heart of the city, a place for markets, for games, and for massive public ceremonies. And around this plaza they built the monuments. They built mounds. But these were not the conical burial mounds of the Adena, or the geometric alignments of the Hopewell. The Mississippians, as we call this new culture, built a new kind of mound, the platform mound. These were massive, flat-topped pyramids of earth designed not to cover the dead but to elevate the living. They were the foundations for the most important buildings in the city, the temples, the meeting houses, and the palaces of the elite. Over 120 of these mounds were built, dotting the city like man-made mountains. And at the head of the great plaza, dominating the entire landscape, they built their masterpiece. We call it Monk's Mound. It is, even today, a shock to the senses. It is the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in the Americas. It is a terraced 4-platform pyramid, rising 100 feet into the sky. Its base is larger than that of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built, like all the others, by hand, basket by basket of earth, dug from the surrounding floodplain and carried by endless lines of laborers. An estimated 22 million cubic feet of soil, all moved without the wheel, without the horse or the ox. It was a project that likely took centuries. a sustained act of collective will and faith. And at its summit, 100 feet above the common world, stood a massive building, perhaps 5,000 square feet, the largest in the city. This was the palace of the ruler. This was not an egalitarian society of gardeners. This was a true stratified hierarchical city-state. Imagine the scene at high noon. The common people, the farmers, the artisans, live in the flatlands, in their rectangular wattle and daub houses, their world defined by the mud of the floodplain. Above them, on the smaller mounds, live the priests and the noble families, literally looking down on the city. And then, high above them all, on the summit of Monk's Mound, lived the paramount chief, the great sun. He was not just a king, he was a god on earth, a brother to the sun itself. His feet, it was said, were not allowed to touch the bare ground. When he emerged from his temple palace, he was a living idol, a symbol of the order and power that held this complex world together. Cahokia was a city of life. The plazas would have been filled with the noise of the market, the smell of wood smoke, the sound of artisans chipping flint and carving intricate designs into shells brought from the Gulf of Mexico. But it was also a city of profound and sometimes dark ritual. Just south of Monk's Mound, archaeologists uncovered a smaller ridge-topped mound, known as Mound 72. What they found inside was a chilling glimpse into the nature of Mississippian power. It was the tomb of a single, important man, a leader or chief from the very beginning of the city. He was laid to rest on a cape or blanket, adorned with over 20,000 seashell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon, a powerful symbol of the warrior and the sky. He was not buried alone. Surrounding him were the remains of hundreds of other people. In one pit, the bodies of 53 young women, all between the ages of 15 and 25, were found, all sacrificed at the same time. In another, 4 men, their heads and hands cut off. Nearby, dozens more bodies laid out in neat rows. This was not a community graveyard. This was a mass ritual sacrifice, a terrifying display of the ruler's power, not just in life but in death. This complex and perhaps brutal society thrived for over 200 years. But to thrive, it also had to defend itself. Around the year 1175, the Cahokians built a wall. Not a small fence, but a 2-mile-long defensive palisade. A stockade of 20,000 massive logs 15 feet high, punctuated by watchtowers. This wall enclosed the entire central precinct, separating the sacred core Monk's Mound and the Great Plaza from the rest of the city. This wall was an immense undertaking, and it was rebuilt 4 times in just over 100 years. This tells us that the Golden Age was beginning to tarnish. The city was under stress. The wall may have been to protect it from outside enemies, rival groups who were now competing for the same resources. Or perhaps the wall was built to protect the elite from their own people, a sign of social unrest and a growing divide. And this is where the mystery of Cahokia's fall begins. By 1250, the city was in a steep decline. By 1350, it was empty, it was not conquered. We find no evidence of a great final battle. The city was not burned to the ground by invaders. It was simply abandoned. The people who had flocked here with such energy and purpose just 3 centuries earlier now turned their backs on the great mounds and walked away. Why? The answer is buried in the earth. The city's very success may have been its undoing. To feed 20,000 people, the farmers had to clear vast tracts of land, pushing their cornfields further and further out. To build the palisade 4 times over, they cut down entire forests. This vast deforestation of the surrounding highlands had a catastrophic effect. With no trees to hold the soil, rain ran off the hills in flash floods, inundating the city's plazas and fields. The city itself, a dense urban center with no sanitation system, would have been a perfect breeding ground for disease. The reliance on a corn-heavy diet, even with beans and squash, led to health problems: tooth decay, anemia, and arthritis. And perhaps most importantly, the system of belief itself failed. The god king on his mound was responsible for the world. He was the intermediary with the sun, the sky, and the seasons. When the floods came, when the crops failed, when disease struck, it was his fault. The social contract was broken. The gods, it seemed, had abandoned Cahokia. The people left. They dispersed, breaking into smaller groups, and carried the Mississippian idea with them down the river. New, smaller mound centers would rise in the following centuries: at Moundville in Alabama, at Etowah in Georgia. But the great first metropolis was finished. When the first French explorers came down the Mississippi River in the 1600s, Cahokia was a ghost. It was just a series of strange green hills on the prairie, silent and overgrown. The people they met, the Cahokia tribe for whom the site is named, had no memory of who had built them. The greatest city in North American history had been completely and utterly forgotten. Masters of the desert, the cliff dwellers of Mesa Verde, we leave now the great green watered world of the Mississippi. We leave the floodplain metropolis of Cahokia, with its earth pyramids and its riverine empire, and we travel west, 1,000 miles and a world away. Our journey takes us high into the sky, to a land of brilliant sun, sharp shadows, and profound sleeping silence. This is the Colorado Plateau, the Four Corners Guide, where the modern states of Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. This is a landscape of geology laid bare. It is a world of horizontal lines, vast flat-topped mountains called mesas, sheer canyon walls of red and yellow sandstone, and an endless deep blue sky. It is a land of extremes. The sun is a punishing force in the summer, and the high-altitude winters are bitter and snow-locked. Water is not a constant like the Mississippi. It is a prayer, a fleeting gift of thunderstorms or a hidden seep in a canyon wall. To live here is to accept a compact with the stone and the sun, and for over 1,000 years, a civilization rose here that was as brilliant, as sophisticated, and as enigmatic as any on the continent. We once called them the Anasazi, a Navajo word that can mean ancient ones, or perhaps ancient enemies. But today we call them by the name their descendants prefer, the ancestral Pueblo. They were the masters of the desert, and they built cities not of earth but of stone in places that defy belief. Their story, like all the others, begins with corn. As we saw in our 4th chapter, maize had traveled north from Mexico, a small tough plant that took 1,000 years to adapt to this high, dry land. But adapt it did, and with corn and its partners, beans and squash, came the great trifecta of civilization: permanent villages, pottery to store the harvest, and time. At first, they lived as their ancestors had, in pite houses, dug deep into the earth for warmth and coolness. But as their population grew and their mastery of farming became more secure, they emerged from the ground. They began to build up. This was their golden age, from roughly 900 to 1150 CE. While Cahokia was booming in the east, and parallel independent civilization was blooming here in the desert. Their great cultural center was not Mesa Verde, not yet. It was a place 100 miles to the south, Chaco Canyon. In a wide, desolate canyon, the Chacons built something new. They built great houses. These were not simple villages. They were massive, pre-planned, multi-story stone apartment complexes, oriented to the sun and stars. The greatest of them, Pueblo Bonito, was a perfect D-shape, rising 4 stories high and containing over 600 rooms. It was the largest apartment building in North America for 700 years, until a new one was built in New York City in the 1880s. The masonry is breathtaking. The Chacoans fitted stone to stone with the precision of jewelers, creating beautiful, patterned walls that have stood for a millennium. They engineered their buildings with thick, load-bearing walls, high ceilings, and complex ventilation systems. And inside these great houses, they built their sacred chambers, the kivas. These were perfectly circular rooms sunk into the earth, a symbolic echo of their ancient lighthouse origins and perhaps a reminder of the Sipapu, the place where their ancestors, in their mythology, emerged from the world below. The kiva was the ceremonial heart of the community, where rituals were performed, stories were told, and the balance of the world was maintained. Chaco was the hub of a vast world. Over 400 miles of perfectly straight engineered roads, some 30 feet wide, radiated out from the canyon, connecting it to dozens of outlier communities. They were not roads for wagons. These people had no wheel, no beast of burden. They were roads for pilgrims, for runners, for trade, and they traded for wonders. From Mexico, 1,000 miles to the south, they imported scarlet macaws, their feathers a flash of impossible color in the desert. They imported copper bells, and from all around the southwest they mined turquoise, the sacred sky stone which they worked into exquisite jewelry. This was a civilization of astronomers, of architects, and of priests. And then, around 1150, the world changed. A drought long and punishing settled on the region. The Chacoan system, a complex society that required an immense surplus, began to fracture. The center could no longer hold. The people began to disperse. They did not vanish. They moved north to the high green plateau of Mesa Verde, the Green Table. Here for a time they lived as they had before, in villages built on the flat, windswept tops of the mesa. Here they could farm their corn, beans, and squash and hunt deer in the forests. But something was wrong. The climate was still unreliable. And perhaps there was a new threat: conflict, social stress. Other groups displaced by the same drought may have been competing for the same land, the same water, the same food. We do not know the exact reason, but around the year 1200 CE, the ancestral pueblo of Mesa Verde made one of the most remarkable architectural and human decisions in history. They moved. They abandoned their safe, convenient homes on the mesa tops, and they moved their entire society into the cliffs. Beneath the rim of the mesa, in the great arching alcoves and caves carved by ancient water, they began to build new homes. These were not simple shelters. These were cities in the sky. Imagine the work. Every single stone had to be quarried and shaped on the mesa top. Every single timber for the roofs had to be felled, often miles away, and carried. Every single basket of mortar and plaster had to be mixed. And all of it had to be lowered down the sheer cliff face or carried up from the canyon floor, using nothing but yucca fiber ropes and their own bare hands. They built over 600 of these cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde. Some were small, just a single family room. Others were staggering. The most famous Cliff Palace is not a palace at all, but a vertical village. It is a single cohesive structure of 150 rooms and 23 kivas, built under the protection of a single, soaring arch of sandstone. It housed perhaps 100 people, their lives now intertwined, their homes stacked one on top of the other, a maze of plazas, towers, and sacred kivas. Life here was a paradox. It was incredibly safe and incredibly difficult. It was a fortress. Tucked into the cliff, they were almost invisible from the canyon floor and nearly impossible to attack from the mesa top. A handful of defenders could hold off any enemy. They were also sheltered from the worst of the summer sun and the winter snow, but the difficulty was immense. There was no water in the alcoves. Women had to climb hundreds of feet down to the canyon bottom, or more often up to the mesa top, to find springs and seeps, carrying the water back in heavy, beautiful ceramic jars. And there was no farmland. Every single day, the farmers, men and women, had to leave the safety of the cliff. They would climb the sheer rock faces using tiny, chiseled hand and toe holds, a vertical commute, to reach their fields on the mesa above. There, they tended the three sisters, the crops that were the margin between life and death. In the evenings, they would return to the village. The plazas would fill with the smoke of pinyon juniper fires. The women would be grinding corn on their stone metates, the rhythmic sandy sound, the heartbeat of the home. The men would gather in the kivas, their voices a low murmur from the sacred space below ground. They were a people of profound community, their survival dependent on a level of cooperation we can scarcely imagine. And they created beauty. Their black-on-white pottery became even more refined, its geometric patterns a kind of visual prayer for rain and balance. They wove intricate baskets and cotton blankets. For less than 100 years, they lived this way, suspended between earth and sky. And then, by the year 1300, they were gone. This is the second great mystery of the Southwest. They had spent 3 generations building these perfect, impregnable homes. They had invested their entire society into this vertical world. And then they left. They walked out of Cliff Palace. They walked out of Balcony House. They left their pottery, their grinding stones, and their sacred kivas as if they intended to return. But they never did. The culprit this time is almost certain. Beginning around 1276, the region was struck by the Great Drought. For 23 straight years, the rains failed. The springs dried up. The crops on the mesa top withered and died. No amount of ritual, no fortress wall can defend against a world without water. The compact with the land was broken. The society of Mesa Verde and of the entire ancestral Pueblo world unraveled. They gathered what they could carry, and they began their last great migration. They did not vanish. We know where they went. They moved south and east, following the rivers seeking a new home. They found it along the Rio Grande in New Mexico, and on the high arid mesas of Hopi Territory in Arizona. They are the ancestors of the modern Pueblo people. The people of Taos, of Acoma, of Zuni, and of Hopi. Their new villages were different, but the core of their culture, the corn, the kiva, and the clans remained. But they left their old homes in the cliffs silent. They remain there today, perfectly preserved by the dry desert air, a stunning, haunting monument to a people who adapted to one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, and for a short, brilliant time, built a civilization in the sky, taming the arid lands. The canal builders of the Southwest. In our last chapter, we stood suspended in the high, cool air of Mesa Verde, among the stone palaces of the ancestral Pueblo. Theirs was a story of adaptation to a vertical world, a world of stone and sky, a world where they prayed for water to fall from the heavens. Now, we travel south, leaving the high mesas and canyons behind. We descend, down into one of the harshest, driest, and hottest landscapes in North America. We come to the floor of the Sonoran Desert. This is the land that would one day be southern Arizona, the basin of the Gila and Salt rivers. Here, the sun is not a gentle force. It is an omnipresent, scouring power. Rain is not just scarce. It is a violent, fleeting memory of summer monsoons. The earth is baked, and the plants that grow here are armored, saguaro, cholla, and palo verde, all specialists in hoarding the tiniest drops of moisture. To a casual observer, this land seems uninhabitable, a place to be endured, not embraced. It would seem impossible that a civilization, a farming society, could rise here, but it did. For this land held a secret. It was crossed by 2 great permanent rivers, the Salt and the Gila, carrying water from the distant mountains. These rivers were lifelines, ribbons of brown, muddy potential in a parched world. And beginning around 450 CE, a new people arrived in this valley who saw not a desert but a canvas. We do not know what they called themselves. The name we use for them, the Hohokam, is a word from the modern O'odham people, meaning those who have gone or all used up. It is a name of mystery for a people who accomplished one of the greatest engineering feats of the pre-Columbian world. They were not the ancestral Pueblo. They were a different people with different traditions. Their origins may lie, at least in part, further south in the cultures of Mexico. They brought with them a different way of life. Like the Pueblo, they lived in pit houses dug into the desert floor. But their villages were more open, more sprawling, and they built, not kivas, but massive open-air ball courts similar to those found in Mesoamerica. These were great oval depressions, their sides banked with earth where a ritual game was played, a game that bound their communities together. And like all people of the Southwest, their life was built upon the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. But here in the Sonoran Desert, farming was not a simple matter of planting on a mesa top and praying for rain. Rain-fed, dry farming was impossible. The corn would die in a week. The Hohokam understood this. They knew that the only way to survive was not to pray for water, but to control it. They had to tame the desert by taming the rivers, and so they began to dig. What the Hohokam accomplished over the next 1,000 years is staggering. A testament to human ingenuity and relentless collective labor. They engineered and built the most extensive and sophisticated irrigation canal system in all of North America. This was not a few simple ditches. This was a vast interconnected network of artificial waterways, a circulatory system that brought the blood of the river deep into the heart of the desert. Let us imagine the work. It begins at the river. The Hohokam engineers, with no metal tools, no draft animals, and no wheeled vehicles, had to build a diversion dam, using only fire-hardened wooden digging sticks and stone tools. They would drive a line of massive posts into the riverbed, weaving a tight wall of brush between them, and then piling tons of rock and earth to create a barrier strong enough to divert a portion of the river's flow. From this dam, the main canal began. These main canals were enormous, some as wide as 80 feet and as deep as 15 feet. They were massive public works, requiring the coordinated labor of thousands of people. Using nothing but stone hoes and woven baskets, they dug. Basketful by basketful, they moved millions of tons of dry, baked desert earth. But digging was only the first part. The true genius of the Hohokam was in their engineering. These canals were not dug at random. They were precisely surveyed, using the naked eye and a profound understanding of gravity. They were built with a perfect, subtle gradient, a drop of only 1 or 2 feet per mile. This gradient was a delicate balancing act. If the canal was too steep, the rushing water would erode the channel, destroying the walls. If it was too shallow, the water would stagnate, and the heavy silt of the river would settle, choking the canal in a single season. The Hohokam engineers found the perfect balance. Their canals flowed just fast enough to deliver the water, but just slow enough to avoid self-destruction. And they built gates made of brush and wood to divert water from the main canals into a spider's web of smaller secondary channels, which in turn fed the final ditches that watered the fields. For 1,000 years, they built, maintained, and expanded this system. At its peak, the Hohokam Canal network near modern-day Phoenix covered over 1,000 miles of channels. It watered an estimated 110,000 acres of desert land, turning a barren waste into a verdant man-made oasis. This was a world transformed by water. In fields that were once cracked earth and creosote, there were now green seas of corn, lush patches of beans, sprawling squash vines, and even fields of cotton which they wove into textiles. This mastery of water was the engine of their civilization. It allowed for a food surplus on a scale that dwarfed what the ancestral Pueblo could ever produce. And with this surplus, their society boomed. Their villages grew into large, stable towns. Their population swelled, perhaps to as many as 50,000 people at its peak. This was one of the most densely populated regions in the ancient Southwest, and with this wealth, their culture flourished. They were master artisans. They developed a distinct, beautiful red-on-buff pottery, its surfaces painted with dancing human figures, waterfowl, and intricate geometric designs. They were masters of shell. From the Gulf of California, hundreds of miles away, they imported shell by the ton. They would carve the shell into delicate bracelets, pendants, and figures. And they practiced a technique that seems almost impossibly advanced: acid etching. They would cover a shell in pitch, carve a design into the pitch, and then soak the shell in a week. Fermented acid, perhaps from the saguaro fruit, which would eat away the exposed shell, leaving a beautiful raised design, like Chaco Canyon. They were part of a vast trade network. They imported turquoise from the Pueblo, obsidian from the north, and macaws and copper bells from Mexico. Around 1150, the same time Chaco was beginning to falter, the Hohokam world changed. The ball courts fell out of use. A new kind of structure and perhaps a new religion arrived from the south, the platform mound. Like the Mississippians at Cahokia, the Hohokam began to build their own pyramids of earth. They were smaller, faced with retaining walls, but their purpose was the same: to elevate the elite. Their society was stratifying, becoming more hierarchical. Temples and the homes of priests or chiefs were now being built on these mounds, looking out over the irrigated green fields that were the source of their power. They were, by any measure, a stunning success. They had done the impossible. They had tamed the arid lands, and then, just like the ancestral Pueblo, they vanished. By the year 1450, a half-century before Columbus would sail, the great canal systems were dead. The fields were dry. The sprawling towns were empty. When the first Spanish missionaries arrived in this valley 200 years later, they found only the ruins of the mounds and the long, dry scars of the ancient canals. They asked the local Odom people who had built them, and they received the only answer that remained: Hohokam. Those who have gone. What happened? Why did a civilization that had thrived for a millennium, a civilization that had mastered its environment, suddenly collapse? The answer, it seems, lies in the water itself. Their very success was a slow-motion catastrophe. The water they brought from the Salt and Gila rivers was not pure. It carried dissolved salts, leached from the rocks of the mountains. When they spread this water on their fields, year after year, century after century, the water evaporated under the desert sun, but the salt was left behind. This was salinization. Slowly, inexorably, the salt built up in the soil, creating a toxic, sterile white crust. The corn, the beans, the squash, they all began to fail. Their fields were being poisoned by the very water that gave them life. There may have been other factors. A long-term drought may have reduced the flow of the rivers. The canal systems themselves, now 1,000 years old, may have become too complex to manage, choked with silt and requiring more labor to maintain than the failing crops could support. It was a slow, agonizing decline. The Hohokam, the masters of the desert, were undone by the subtle, long-term consequences of their own brilliance. They did not die out. Like the Pueblo, they scattered. They abandoned the great centralized towns and the poisoned fields, and broke into smaller, more mobile groups. They returned to a simpler way of life, perhaps moving to new, unspoiled stretches of the river. The people who met the Spanish, The Pima and the Tohono O'odham are their descendants. But the memory of the great canal-building age, the time of the platform mounds in the continental trade, was gone. All that remained were the canals themselves, silent and empty, a vast geometric ghost on the desert floor. They are a monument to a people who did not just live in the desert, but who remade it in their own image, and for 1,000 years made the driest land in America bloom, a tapestry of nations. From the Pacific coast to the Great Plains in our journey, we have watched great empires rise and fall. We have stood atop the earthen pyramids of Cahokia, hearing the murmur of America's first metropolis. We have climbed into the stone palaces of Mesa Verde, and we have stood beside the canals of the Hohokam, watching as they made the desert bloom. And we have also watched them fall. We saw Cahokia abandoned, its great plazas gone silent. We saw the people of Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde walk away from their homes, driven by a devastating drought. It would be easy to believe that the continent was left empty, that after the fall of these great civilizations, America reverted to a silent, unpeopled wilderness. But the truth was the very opposite. The continent was never empty. It was a living collection of 1,000 different solutions, 1,000 different worlds. In the absence of dominant centers like Cahokia or Chaco, the continent did not fall silent. It simply hummed with 1,000 individual melodies rather than a single, booming chord. This was a tapestry of nations, a rich gobelin, where every thread was a distinct culture, a unique language, and an ingenious way of life. In this chapter, we will explore a few of those worlds that did not build pyramids of earth or stone, but which fashioned civilizations of incredible richness and complexity in their own right. The land of plenty, the Pacific Northwest. Let us travel west, to the coast of the Pacific Ocean. This is a world that does not follow the rules. It is a world of rain, mist, and giant trees. Here, the steep slopes of the Cascade Mountains trap the ocean moisture, separating the coast from the inland deserts and creating a lush, temperate rainforest. The people who lived here, the Kwakwakawaku, the Tsimshian and the Haida, were hunter-gatherers. But they completely shatter our traditional image of what a hunter-gatherer society is. They had no need for agriculture, because their rivers were themselves living fields of grain. The engine of this civilization was the salmon. Every year, millions of salmon returned from the sea to their spawning rivers. This abundance was staggering. These cultures built complex weirs and nets. They harvested so much fish it could last the entire year. They smoked and dried it, creating a storable surplus, their own version of corn. And they had the tree of life, the red cedar. From this giant tree, they built 60-foot-long, ocean-going dugout canoes. They built massive plank houses where multiple families lived. They wove the bark into waterproof clothing baskets and rope. And they carved this wood to tell their lineage and legends in the magnificent art we know today as totem poles. Because they did not need to be nomadic, they built permanent, wealthy villages. And this wealth created a complex social structure. This was not an egalitarian society. There were noble families who owned the best fishing spots or berry patches. There were commoners, and there were slaves, often captured in raids. Their politics centered on a remarkable ceremony known as the potlatch. This was a feast of honor. A chief or noble would prove his status by hosting a massive feast where he would give away, and sometimes even destroy, all of his accumulated wealth: canoes, blankets, copper. In this society, you did not become powerful by hoarding wealth. You became powerful by giving it away. It was a civilization of abundance, built without a single seed of agriculture. The masters of scarcity. The Great Basin now, we leave the rainforest of the coast and enter a world that is its complete opposite. We cross the Cascades and Sierra Nevada mountains into the Great Basin. This is the high cold desert of modern Nevada and Utah. This is a land of scarcity. There are no salmon rivers, no cedar forests. Life here is hard, and the people who lived here, like the Shoshone and the Paiute, were the true masters of survival. Here the ancient archaic lifestyle, which we saw in Chapter 3, never ended. Instead, it was perfected over thousands of years. These people were nomadic, but they did not wander aimlessly. Their life was a precise schedule, a seasonal round. They had memorized the calendar of the natural world. In the spring, they were in the low valleys, gathering the first green shoots and seeds. In the summer, they moved up into the mountains, hunting bighorn sheep or antelope. But the most important time of year was the fall. This was the piñon nut harvest. These small fatty nuts from the pine tree were their winter surplus, their salmon, their corn. Entire families would work together to harvest these nuts, drying and storing them to survive the long, cold winter. Their society was the opposite of the coastal peoples. It was deeply egalitarian. There were no kings or nobles. The most important unit was the family. They had no permanent villages. Their homes were light and portable, made of brush or willow. Their technology was light and effective. Their wealth was their knowledge, a perfect mental map of every spring and every nut-bearing tree in their territory. Their most important tools were the mano and metate grinding stones, for turning seeds and nuts into nutritious flour, and the woven basket, woven so tightly it could hold water. They were specialists in finding abundance within scarcity, the people of the buffalo. The Great Plains. Finally, we travel east from the Great Basin and enter the heart of America, the Great Plains. This was a sea of grass, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, and this sea of grass was ruled by a single, massive power, the bison or the American buffalo. Just before European contact, the plains was not one culture, but a meeting place of two different ways of life. First, there were the river people. Along the great rivers like the Missouri, peoples like the Mandan and Hidatsa lived in permanent palisaded villages. They were farmers. They lived in massive, dome-shaped earth lodges and farmed the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, in the fertile river bottoms. But twice a year they would leave their villages to go on great communal bison hunts out on the plains. Second, there were the nomadic hunters. These are the cultures we often picture as Plains Indians, the ancestors of the Lakota or the Cheyenne. At this time, it is crucial to remember one fact. There were no horses. Horses had been extinct in America since the Ice Age and would only be reintroduced by the Spanish. So, these were pedestrian hunters. Their entire world revolved around following the bison herds. How do you hunt these massive, fast animals without a horse? They did it with intelligence. They used communal hunts. Sometimes they would use a bison jump, stampeding a herd over a high cliff just as their Folsom ancestors had done. Or they would surround a herd and hunt them on foot with bows and spears. Their life was one of motion. Their home was the teepee, a perfect conical tent made of bison hides easily taken down and packed. Their beast of burden was the dog, which pulled a simple A-frame sled called a travois. The bison was their tree of life. It provided everything. The meat was dried and pounded with fat and berries to make pemmican, their winter surplus. The hide was used for tippies, clothing, and shoes. The bones were used for tools and the horns for spoons. Conclusion: the tapestry. And so in the year 1491, on the eve of Columbus's arrival, this continent was anything but empty. It was a complex and vibrant world. On the Pacific coast, Wealthy nobles were hosting potlatches. In the Great Basin, a family was harvesting piñon nuts, securing their survival for the winter. And on the Great Plains, a group of pedestrian hunters was following a herd of bison. The great metropolis of Cahokia had fallen, but from its ashes, 1,000 new cultures had been born. Each was a brilliant response to its own environment. This tapestry of diverse nations was the true face of pre-Columbian America, a vast, complex, and living world, about to be changed forever by the arrival of ships from the east. 91. The American world on the brink of change, our long journey is coming to an end. We have walked with the first hunters as they entered a new world of ice. We have stood in the shadow of giants, and we have watched those giants vanish in the great thaw. We have seen the first seeds of civilization take root in the river valleys, and we have marveled at the enigmatic mounds of the Hopewell. We have stood in the grand plaza of Cahokia, America's first metropolis. We have climbed to the cliff palaces of Mesa Verde, suspended between earth and sky. We have traced the life-giving canals of the Hohokam and journeyed through the rich tapestry of the coasts and plains. And in our journey, we have seen great societies rise, and we have seen them fall. Cahokia is a ghost. Chaco Canyon is a silent memory. The cliff dwellers have moved on. It is easy to look at these empty monuments and imagine a continent that has failed. An empty land, a wilderness waiting for a new story to begin. This is the greatest myth of all. The year is 1491. It is the last moment of quiet. A single held breath before the world changes forever. This continent is not empty. It is not a pristine, untouched wilderness. It is a human landscape home to millions of people. It is a quilt of nations, languages, and belief systems, the result of 15,000 years of human history. The great empires are gone, but in their place is a world of vibrant, resilient, and complex societies. The people of 1491 are not savages. They are the inheritors of ancient civilizations. And they are living in a world they have shaped, a world they understand in its deepest rhythms. Let us take one last walk across this continent. In this final year of its independent history, we begin in the east, in the lands that were once the dominion of Cahokia. The Mississippian idea did not die. It simply scattered like seeds on the wind. The southeastern ceremonial complex still thrives. In what is now Georgia, the chiefdom of Etowah is a major center, its platform mounds still in use. Along the rivers of Alabama and Mississippi, the ancestors of the Creek, Choctaw, and Cherokee live in fortified towns. They are farmers, their lives built on the sacred trinity of corn, beans, and squash. Their world is one of complex politics, of shifting alliances and rival chiefdoms. Further north, in the forests of what will be New York, a new political innovation is being born. Here the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois, are living in large palisaded villages, in their traditional bark-covered longhouses. They are a fierce agricultural people, and around this time, perhaps in this very generation, a great prophet and a statesman, Diganawida and Hiawatha, are bringing a message of peace, uniting 5 warring nations into the Great League of Peace. They are forming a representative government, a confederacy that will endure for centuries. Along the Atlantic coast, from the Carolinas to Maine, are the Algonquian-speaking peoples. They are fishermen, hunters, and farmers. They are the people of the long coast, the first who will see the strange great-sailed canoes appear over the eastern horizon. We travel west, to the Great Plains. The world here is one of grass and sky, and it is dominated by the bison. We must remember, this is a world without the horse. The ancestors of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche are here, but they are pedestrian hunters. Their lives are a marathon, following the great herds on foot. Their only beast of burden is the dog, pulling a small travois. The bison hunt is a tactical, terrifying, and communal act of courage. But the plains are not just nomadic. Along the great muddy rivers like the Missouri, the Mandan and Hidatsa live in large, permanent villages of dome-shaped earth lodges. They are the farmers of the plains, their fields of corn and sunflowers a beacon of stability. Their villages are the hubs of a vast trade network, connecting the forests of the east to the mountains of the west. We go south to the southwest. The great drought is a memory, and the people have rebuilt their world. The children of the ancestral Pueblo are now the Pueblo peoples of today. They have left the cliffs. Their new homes are great, multi-story apartment houses of adobe and stone, built along the Rio Grande and on the high, arid mesas of Hopi territory. This is a world of profound peace and deep theology. Their lives are governed by the Katsinas, the spirit beings who bring the rain. The Kiva, their underground ceremonial chamber, is the center of their universe. They are the greatest dry farmers on earth, and their lives are a complex, year-long ceremony to maintain balance with a harsh but beautiful land. And into this ancient land, new arrivals are trickling in from the north. These are the Athabascan speakers, the hunters and raiders who will become the Navajo and the Apache. They are a new dynamic force, a people who will soon write their own legendary chapter in this desert. We continue west, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. In the Pacific Northwest, the world of salmon and cedar is in its full, rich glory. The coastal villages of the Haida, Tlingit, and Kwakwaka'wakw are thriving. This is a world of abundance, so rich that they never needed farming. It is a society of artists, of nobles, of commoners, and of slaves. Great potlatch feasts are held, where chiefs cement their status by giving away fortunes in canoes, blankets, and sacred copper. And to the south, in what will be California, we find one of the most densely populated and diverse places on the continent. This is not a single nation, but a patchwork of hundreds of small independent groups, speaking more than 100 different languages. They are the masters of the acorn, which they have learned to process into a nutritious staple. They are the greatest basket makers the world has ever known. They too live in a land of plenty, a world without corn but rich in game, fish, and seeds. This is the world of 1491. It is not an empty landscape. It is full. It is populated by an estimated 7 to 18 million people north of Mexico, and tens of millions more to the south. And this world is connected. It is not a mosaic of isolated tribes. It is a continent woven together by ancient footpaths and river highways. Abalone shell from California finds its way to the desert. Turquoise from the southwest is traded all the way to the Mississippi. Conch shells from the Gulf of Mexico are found in the heart of the Midwest. Ideas as well as goods travel these routes. This is also a managed world. The pristine wilderness the first Europeans would write about was a misunderstanding. It was a garden. For millennia, the people of this continent had been shaping it with fire. They burned the underbrush of the forest to promote the growth of berry bushes and to create grazing land for deer. They cleared land for their fields, and their abandoned fields created the meadows the settlers so prized. The great open forests of the East were a human creation. This was a world of deep shared beliefs. Across the continent, from the Iroquois to the Pueblo, you find a similar cosmology. A world of layers with a sky world above and an underworld below. A belief in the sacredness of the four directions and a deep spiritual connection to the animals with whom they shared the land. This was not a utopia. It was a human world. There was warfare, drought, and political collapse. There was suffering and there was sacrifice. But it was a complete world, evolving on its own terms in 1,000 different brilliant ways. It is 1491. The air is still. The smoke from 1,000,000 campfires rises into the American sky. In the forest, a hunter is stalking a deer. In the desert, a priest is entering a kiva to pray for rain. On the plains, a woman is grinding corn. On the coast, a canoe is being carved from a single giant cedar. They do not know that on the other side of a vast impassable ocean, a handful of ships are being prepared. They do not know that a new migration is about to begin. A migration that will bring with it not just people, but steel, gunpowder, and microbes against which they have no defense. They do not know that their 15,000-year-old story is about to be interrupted, and that the world they have built is standing on the brink of an unimaginable change. This is the American world in its final moment of independent existence. A rich, ancient, and complex tapestry, shimmering in the last light of its own long day.